most people misunderstand about the weird behaviors of people abused by narcissists is those behaviors aren't signs of weakness, mental illness, or personality flaws. They are signs of survival. When someone has been psychologically manipulated for months or years, their mind rewires itself just to keep them alive inside that relationship. And when they finally leave, or even while they're still in it, the outside world looks at them and asks, why do they act so strange? Why do they apologize for everything? Why do they flinch at kindness? Why do they defend the very person who destroyed them? Here's what nobody tells you. Those weird behaviors make perfect sense once you understand what that person has been through. The hypervigilance, the people-pleasing, the inability to trust their own mind. These aren't random. They were trained, conditioned, beaten into them, not always with fists, but with words, silence, gaslighting, and manipulation so subtle that even the victim couldn't see it happening. So before you judge someone for acting off after a narcissistic relationship, understand this. You are not looking at a broken person. You are looking at a person whose nervous system learned to adapt to a war zone that had no name. Here is something that will stop you in your tracks if you've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist, or if you've watched someone you love survive one. They apologize for everything. They apologize for speaking too loudly, for having an opinion, for taking up space, for asking a question, for being 5 minutes late, for crying, for not crying, for existing in a way that might in any possible universe inconvenience someone else. And when you watch it from the outside, it looks strange, it looks excessive. It looks like a habit they could simply drop if they just decided to stop. But here is what most people completely miss. That apology is not a personality quirk. It is not low self-esteem in the traditional sense. It is a deeply conditioned reflex that was built brick by brick inside a relationship where being wrong was dangerous. Let me explain what that actually means. When you live with a narcissist, whether it is a partner, a parent, a boss, or a close friend, you very quickly learn one unspoken rule. Everything that goes wrong is your fault. Not occasionally, not sometimes, every single time. The narcissist burned dinner, you distracted them. They forgot an important date. You should have reminded them. They exploded in anger at a public event. You embarrassed them first. The logic is always circular and the conclusion is always the same. You are the problem. Now imagine hearing that message not once, not twice, but hundreds of times, thousands of times. In arguments, in quiet moments, in the middle of the night, in front of other people, in private conversations where there are no witnesses. Imagine being told repeatedly and with total conviction that your perception is wrong, your feelings are exaggerated, your memory is faulty, and your instincts cannot be trusted. At some point, your mind stops fighting it. This is not weakness. This is the human brain doing exactly what it is designed to do. When you are in an environment where a certain belief, even a false one, reduces conflict and keeps you safer, your brain will begin to adopt that belief as truth. It is an adaptive response. It is survival logic. And the belief the brain lands on after enough repetition and enough pain is this: I am probably wrong. I am probably the one at fault. I should apologize first, apologize fast, and apologize completely, because that is the only thing that makes the storm stop. And here is where it gets even deeper. The apology, over time, stops being a response to a specific event. It becomes a default setting. It becomes the first language the nervous system speaks when tension appears anywhere in the room. Not just with the narcissist, with everyone, with co-workers, with friends, with strangers at a grocery store. The brain has been trained to associate conflict, any form of displeasure in another person with personal failure. So the automatic response fires before the conscious mind even has time to ask the question, wait, did I actually do something wrong here? This is why survivors of narcissistic abuse will apologize in situations where a healthy person would simply clarify, set a boundary, or do nothing at all. They are not being dramatic. They are not fishing for reassurance. Their nervous system has genuinely mapped apology as the safest exit from discomfort. It learned that from thousands of repetitions inside a relationship that punished them for not apologizing and rewarded them, even if only with temporary peace, for doing it quickly. Now think about what this does to a person's identity over time. When you spend long enough believing you are always at fault, you stop trusting your own moral compass. You stop trusting your gut when it tells you that something someone did was unkind, unfair, or wrong. Because the internal voice, the one that used to say, wait, that wasn't okay, has been slowly replaced by another voice, one that sounds suspiciously like the narcissist. One that says, you're too sensitive, you're overreacting, you probably did something to cause this, just apologize and move on. This is one of the most damaging long-term effects of narcissistic abuse that almost nobody talks about. It is not just that the person was hurt. It is that the hurt came from someone who simultaneously dismantled the internal tools that would help the person recognize and process the hurt. The victim was being wounded and having their ability to understand the wound removed at the same time. So when they leave that relationship and step into the outside world, they carry both of those things with them, the wound and the missing tools. And because they have lost access to their own inner authority, they default to what was drilled into them. Assume fault, absorb blame, apologize early, apologize often, and always prioritize the comfort of others over the truth of their own experience. And people around them sometimes get frustrated by this. They say things like, stop saying sorry for everything, or you don't need to apologize for that, and they mean well. But what they don't realize is that simply telling a survivor to stop apologizing is like telling someone to stop limping after a broken leg. The limp is not a choice. It is a consequence of an injury that hasn't fully healed yet. The constant apologizing is also in many cases tied to something even more specific, the fear of someone else's anger. Inside narcissistic abuse, anger from the narcissist almost always meant punishment. It meant withdrawal of affection, escalation of conflict, public humiliation, days of silence, or something worse. So the survivor's brain made a direct connection. Someone else's anger equals immediate danger. And the fastest way to neutralize that danger, the one tool that sometimes worked, was the preemptive apology. Get ahead of the anger, soften the landing before the impact arrives. This is why survivors will sometimes apologize when no one is even angry. They read micro-expressions. They notice a slightly flat tone of voice, a pause that lasted 1 second too long, an eyebrow that moved in a way that felt like disapproval. And before the other person has even formed a thought, the survivor has already begun managing the situation, shrinking themselves, softening their presence, preparing the apology that might not even be needed. This level of vigilance is exhausting. It is mentally and emotionally depleting in a way that is very difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. Imagine running threat assessment software in your brain, every hour of every day, in every social interaction, constantly scanning for signs that you have somehow caused a problem that you now need to fix. That is the daily internal reality of many survivors of narcissistic abuse. And the cruelest part? Even when they recognize what is happening, even when they intellectually understand that the apology is unnecessary, the feeling remains, the body still tenses, the throat still tightens. The urge to say the words, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," does not disappear simply because the mind has caught up to the truth. Because this was never only a thought pattern. It became a body pattern, a nervous system pattern. It lives in the muscles and the breath, and the posture and the automatic reactions that fire faster than conscious thought. And that is why healing from this particular behavior takes far more than good advice and positive thinking. It takes time, safety, repetition of new experiences, and often real professional support to begin to unwire what abuse spent years carefully wiring in. So the next time you see someone who apologizes for everything, who shrinks when you raise your voice slightly, who takes the blame even when it clearly does not belong to them, who seems almost physically uncomfortable receiving a compliment without immediately deflecting it, do not see weakness. See endurance. See a person who survived a psychological environment designed to make them believe they were always wrong and who is now slowly, quietly, courageously learning that they never had to earn their right to exist in the first place. There is a question that people ask more than almost any other when they find out someone is in a relationship with a narcissist. And the question is not about the narcissist, it is about the victim. The question is always some version of this: why don't they just leave? And underneath that question, if you listen closely, is an assumption. The assumption is that leaving should be simple. That once you can see the damage, once you can name the pain, once you have clear evidence that this person is hurting you, the natural human response is to walk away. And if you don't walk away, something must be wrong with you. You must be weak. You must enjoy the suffering. You must not love yourself enough. That assumption is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because it blames the victim for the very mechanism that the abuser created. Let me tell you what is actually happening inside a person who stays, or inside a person who finally leaves but cannot stop grieving, cannot stop checking the narcissist's social media, cannot stop picking up the phone when they call, cannot stop defending them to people who are trying to help. What looks like a choice from the outside is not a choice at all. It is a bond, a trauma bond, and it is one of the most powerful psychological chains that can exist between two human beings. Here is how it gets built. It does not start with abuse. That is the part people miss entirely. It starts with something that feels extraordinary. The narcissist in the early stages of a relationship is often the most attentive, most magnetic, most deeply interested person the victim has ever encountered. They make you feel seen in a way that is almost overwhelming. They mirror your values, your dreams, your sense of humor. They tell you things like you are different from everyone else I have ever met. They move fast, emotionally, sometimes physically, and they create an intensity that the nervous system reads as deep connection. This phase has a name. It is called love bombing. And it is not accidental. Whether the narcissist does it consciously or not, the effect is the same. It floods the brain with dopamine, with oxytocin, with a sense of finally being truly known by another person. And that flood creates a neurological attachment, a real one, not imagined, not foolish. Real chemical, biological attachment, the same kind of attachment that forms between a mother and a child, between lifelong friends, between people who have been through something profound together. And then the shift happens. The warmth begins to withdraw. The criticism begins to appear. The moods become unpredictable. The person who once made you feel like the center of the universe now makes you feel like an inconvenience, a disappointment, a burden. And here is where the trap closes, because the brain, having formed that deep attachment, does not conclude that the person has changed. The brain concludes that something has gone wrong and that you need to fix it. You need to get back to what it was. You need to find the version of them that made you feel that way again. So you try harder, you become more accommodating, more attentive, more careful about the words you choose and the way you show up. You start monitoring their moods like a meteorologist monitors a hurricane, not to predict pleasure, but to predict danger. And occasionally, after a period of coldness or cruelty, the warmth returns. Briefly, just enough, a moment of tenderness, a flash of the person you fell in love with. And your brain lights up the same way it did in the beginning. This is not weakness, this is intermittent reinforcement. And it is the single most powerful conditioning mechanism known to behavioral psychology. It is the same principle that makes gambling addictive. The unpredictable reward, the win that comes just often enough to keep you pulling the lever, creates a compulsion that is genuinely neurological. The brain becomes addicted to the cycle, not to the pain, to the relief after the pain, to the moment the coldness breaks and the sun comes back, even for an hour. And so the bond that forms inside narcissistic abuse is not a bond built on love in the traditional sense. It is a bond built on survival, on hope, on the neurological echo of the person they were in the beginning, and on the unpredictable delivery of warmth inside a desert of emotional deprivation. That is a harder bond to break than most people can imagine, because it is not just in the heart, it is in the nervous system, it is in the body. This is why leaving does not end the bond. This is why someone can be physically out of the relationship and still feel an almost physical pullback toward the person who hurt them. It is why they will check the narcissist's social media at 2 in the morning, not because they are foolish, but because the brain is still running its original program. Find the connection, find the warmth, find the version of this person that made everything feel safe. And then there is the grief. The grief that comes after leaving a narcissistic relationship is unlike grief from a healthy relationship ending. In a healthy relationship, you grieve the person. In a narcissistic relationship, you grieve two things simultaneously, and they are almost opposites. You grieve the person they pretended to be, and you grieve the realization that person was never real. That is a particularly cruel kind of loss. Because you cannot hold a funeral for someone who never existed, you cannot process the absence of something you never truly had. You find yourself mourning a version of a person who was in many ways a performance, a reflection of your own needs and desires thrown back at you in the early stages to create attachment. And when you finally understand that, the grief does not get easier. It gets more complicated. Because now you are also dealing with a quiet, devastating question that sits at the center of recovery from narcissistic abuse. If that person was not real, were my feelings real? Was any of it real? The answer is yes. Your feelings were real. Your love was real. The bond was real. What was not real was the person you gave those things to. And the defense, the defending of the narcissist to friends, to family, to therapists, to anyone who tries to help, that comes from this same place. Because if the people around you are right, if the narcissist really is as harmful as they are saying, then the mind has to reconcile something almost unbearable. It has to accept that the relationship it poured everything into, the person it reorganized its entire life around, the love it believed in completely, was built on a foundation that was never solid. That kind of truth does not land gently. It lands like the ground disappearing beneath your feet. So the brain protects itself. It finds reasons to defend. It focuses on the good moments, the rare tenderness, the times the narcissist seemed genuinely remorseful or genuinely kind. Not because the survivor is naive, but because the alternative, accepting the full reality all at once, is a psychological collapse the mind is not prepared to survive in a single moment. Healing from a trauma bond is not a decision. It is not a moment of clarity where everything shifts. It is a slow, non-linear process of the nervous system learning, over time through safety, through new experiences, through support, that it does not need to keep searching for something that was never consistently there. It is the brain learning, gradually and painfully, that the relief it keeps chasing does not live in that person anymore. And it never really did. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that survivors of narcissistic abuse carry that almost nobody around them can see. It is not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. It is something deeper. Something that lives underneath the surface of every interaction, every room they walk into, every relationship they try to build after the abuse has ended. It is the exhaustion of a nervous system that never fully turns off, a body that never fully relaxes, a mind that is always watching. This is called hypervigilance. And it is one of the most misunderstood after effects of narcissistic abuse. From the outside, a hypervigilant person can look paranoid. They can look anxious for no reason. They can look like they are overreacting to small things, a shift in someone's tone, a door that closes slightly too hard, a moment of silence in a conversation that lasts 2 seconds longer than expected. They flinch at things that do not register as threatening to anyone else in the room. They read into words, expressions, body language with a level of precision that can seem almost obsessive. But here is what that behavior actually is. It is the result of a nervous system that spent months or years inside an environment where danger was real, unpredictable, and came from the one person who was supposed to be safe. And in that environment, the ability to detect danger early was not paranoia. It was protection. It was the skill that kept the damage from being worse than it already was. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what it is like to live with emotional unpredictability as a daily reality. In a narcissistic relationship, the atmosphere is never stable. There is no consistent emotional weather. There are no reliable rules for how a person will respond on any given day, in any given moment. The same joke that made them laugh last Tuesday makes them cold and distant this Tuesday. The same affection that was welcomed yesterday is called suffocating today. The same accomplishment that earned praise one week earns criticism or indifference the next. And the critical thing about this unpredictability is that it is not random from the narcissist's perspective, but it is completely random from the victim's perspective. Which means the victim cannot identify a pattern. They cannot predict what is coming. And when you cannot predict what is coming in an environment that regularly delivers pain, your nervous system makes a decision. It decides to monitor everything, all the time. Because if the warning signal is there, the only way to catch it is to never stop looking. So the brain begins running a continuous threat detection process. It starts cataloging every micro expression, every slight variation in tone, every subtle shift in behavior. It becomes extraordinarily sensitive to changes in emotional atmosphere, not because the person is dramatic or unstable, but because their survival inside that relationship genuinely depended on detecting those changes as early as possible. The earlier you could sense the shift in mood, the sooner you could adjust your behavior, soften your presence, prepare your apology, or simply get out of the room. This is not a conscious decision. This is the nervous system, specifically the part of the brain called the amygdala, which processes threat, being trained over time to stay permanently activated, to treat the baseline as dangerous, to interpret even neutral situations as potentially threatening until proven otherwise. And the tragic part is that this process, which was once adaptive and genuinely protective, does not switch off when the relationship ends. The brain does not receive a memo that says the war is over. It continues running its original program, in new environments, with new people, long after the original danger has passed. This is what it means to walk on eggshells, even when there are no eggshells left. The survivor moves into a new home, starts a new job, begins a new friendship, and they bring with them a nervous system that has been fundamentally reshaped by prolonged exposure to emotional danger. They sit in a work meeting and their colleague uses a slightly sharp tone to disagree with an idea, and their body responds as though a physical threat just entered the room. Heart rate increases. Breath becomes shallow. The mind begins rapidly calculating how to de-escalate, how to accommodate, how to make the discomfort stop. Not because the colleague is dangerous, but because sharp tones were once a reliable signal that something bad was about to happen. A partner asks a simple question: "Where did you put the keys?" And the survivor feels their stomach drop. Not because the question is threatening, but because questions were once used as setup. As the first line in a sequence that ended with blame, with anger, with hours of cold silence or relentless criticism, the nervous system learned to associate certain tones, certain questions, certain pauses with what came after them. And now those associations fire automatically, faster than rational thought can intervene. This is also why survivors of narcissistic abuse often struggle enormously in moments of conflict that healthy people navigate with relative ease. A minor disagreement with a friend sends them into a spiral of anxiety that feels wildly disproportionate to the situation. A loved one expressing frustrations about something unrelated still triggers a flood of self-blame and fear, because the nervous system is not responding to what is actually happening. It is responding to what that situation once meant in a context where it was genuinely threatening. And the hypervigilance does not only show up in response to potential threat, it also shows up in response to unexpected kindness. This is the part that confuses people most. Survivors will sometimes become uncomfortable, almost suspicious, when someone is consistently kind to them, consistently patient, consistently gentle, because calm was not always safe either. In the narcissistic relationship, calm sometimes preceded the storm. Kindness sometimes preceded a request for something that would cost the survivor enormously. Warmth sometimes preceded a manipulation. And so the nervous system, ever loyal to its training, begins to mistrust peace. It reads safety as a trap. It waits for the other shoe to drop even in rooms where there is no other shoe. This creates an incredibly painful internal contradiction for survivors in new, healthy relationships. They want to trust. They want to relax. They want to believe that this person, this situation, this place is different. But the body keeps sending alarm signals into an environment that does not deserve them. And that gap between what the mind knows and what the body feels is one of the loneliest parts of recovering from this kind of abuse. Because you can tell yourself you are safe 100 times a day and still feel the tension in your shoulders every time someone walks into the room with an unreadable expression. You can know intellectually that your new partner is nothing like your old one and still find yourself holding your breath when you hear the front door open, running a rapid subconscious calculation. What mood are they in? What do I need to prepare for? Am I safe right now? That hyper-awareness, that continuous low-frequency hum of alertness that never fully quiets, that is the nervous system doing the only job it was ever trained to do. Protect, monitor, anticipate, survive. The path out of hypervigilance is not about thinking your way to calm. It is not about logic or willpower or simply deciding to stop being anxious. It is about accumulating enough new experiences, slowly, patiently, repeatedly, in which the alarm fires and nothing bad happens, in which the tension rises and the room stays safe, in which the nervous system is given, over time, enough evidence to begin revising its predictions. To begin trusting, not as a belief, but as a felt body experience, that the danger it has been guarding against is no longer present. It is slow. It is non-linear. Some days feel like full recovery, and some days feel like the first day all over again. But the nervous system that learned fear through repetition can also learn safety through repetition. It just needs time, patience, and an environment that finally keeps its promises. There is a specific moment that many survivors of narcissistic abuse describe, and it is one of the most quietly devastating moments a human being can experience. It is not the moment of the biggest argument. It is not the moment they finally leave. It is a smaller moment, an ordinary one. They are standing in a grocery store or sitting in a car or lying in bed in the dark, and they try to answer a simple question. What do I actually think about this? What do I actually feel? What do I actually want? And there is nothing there. Not confusion exactly. Something worse than confusion. A blankness where a self used to be. A silence where an inner voice used to live. And in that moment, they realize that somewhere along the way, without ever noticing it happen, they lost access to their own mind. This is what gaslighting does. Not in the dramatic way it is sometimes described, not always in the obvious theatrical way where someone looks you in the eye and says that never happened. It is often far subtler than that, far more patient, far more systematic. And by the time the damage is fully done, the person standing in that grocery store aisle cannot tell you with any confidence what is real, what is remembered accurately, what they genuinely feel, or whether any of their perceptions can be trusted at all. To understand what gaslighting actually dismantles, you first have to understand what it targets. Every person carries something that functions as an internal compass. It is built over years from lived experience, from memory, from the consistent feedback loop between your perceptions and reality. When you feel hurt, your internal compass says, something happened that caused this hurt. When you remember an event a certain way, your internal compass says, this is what occurred. When your instincts send a signal that something is wrong, your internal compass says, pay attention to this signal. It is the foundation on which every decision, every relationship, every sense of self is built. Gaslighting attacks that compass directly, systematically, repeatedly. It begins with small contradictions. You mention something that happened and the narcissist tells you it did not happen that way. You express hurt about something they said and they tell you that you misheard, misunderstood, or invented the meaning entirely. You point to a pattern you have noticed and they explain, calmly or with irritation, that you are being irrational, that you are too sensitive, that you always do this. You always find something to be upset about. You always twist things. You always make them the villain. In the beginning, you push back. You trust yourself enough to say, no, I remember it differently. But the narcissist is consistent. They do not waver. They repeat their version with the kind of certainty that makes your own memory feel unstable. And over time, a very human thing begins to happen. You start to wonder, not just about the specific event, about your reliability as a witness to your own life. And once that wondering takes root, the narcissist's work becomes significantly easier. Because now you bring the doubt yourself. Now you preemptively question your own perceptions before anyone challenges them. You feel hurt and immediately ask yourself, am I overreacting? You notice something concerning and immediately wonder, am I being paranoid? You form an opinion and immediately soften it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not seeing this clearly. Maybe I should ask them what they think before I trust my own reading of the situation. This self-questioning, which began as a response to external pressure, becomes an internal habit. And it is one of the most insidious long-term effects of narcissistic abuse because it means the gaslighting no longer requires the narcissist to be present. The victim begins doing it to themselves. The voice that says you are too sensitive, you are remembering it wrong, you are making this bigger than it is, that voice starts sounding less like the narcissist and more like the survivor's own thoughts. The abuser has, in the most complete sense of the word, colonized the person's inner world. What this creates in daily life is a kind of chronic cognitive instability that affects everything. Decisions become extraordinarily difficult. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because every decision requires trusting your own perception of a situation, and that trust has been severely eroded. Simple choices carry a disproportionate weight of anxiety because the person no longer has reliable access to the internal compass that helps most people navigate choices with reasonable confidence. Memories become unreliable, or rather, the person's relationship to their own memories becomes unreliable. They may remember something clearly, but be unable to hold that memory with any conviction because they have been told so many times that their clear memories were wrong. So they move through life-carrying experiences they live through, but cannot fully claim because the certainty that normally anchors memory to identity has been deliberately and repeatedly undermined. Emotions become confusing, not just to communicate to others, but to read internally. A survivor may feel something, discomfort, anger, grief, and be genuinely uncertain about whether that feeling is valid, proportionate, or trustworthy. They have been taught for so long that their emotional responses were exaggerated or incorrect that they no longer know how to receive their own feelings as information. Instead, feelings become problems to be managed, explained away, or suppressed before anyone else notices and confirms what the narcissist always said, that they are too much. And perhaps the deepest damage of all is what gaslighting does to a person's sense of reality itself. There is a psychological concept called epistemic autonomy, the ability to form your own beliefs about the world based on your own direct experience of it. It is something most people take completely for granted. You see something, you believe you saw it. You experience something, you believe it happened. You feel something, you trust that the feeling corresponds to something real in your inner world. Epistemic autonomy is so fundamental to functioning as a human being that most people never think about it at all. Survivors of sustained gaslighting have had that autonomy systematically stripped from them. They no longer trust the basic pipeline between experience and belief. They live in a state of constant low-grade uncertainty about their own perceptions, which means they are perpetually dependent on external confirmation to feel stable. They need someone else to tell them what happened was real. They need someone else to validate that their feeling makes sense. Not because they are weak, but because the internal system that performs that validation for most people was deliberately dismantled. This is also why survivors often struggle to articulate their abuse to others, even to therapists, even to people they trust completely. It is not that they do not remember what happened. It is that they have been conditioned to present every memory with a caveat, to immediately offer the narcissist's alternative explanation alongside their own account. To say things like, and I know this probably sounds like I'm exaggerating, or maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but as a reflex, because they have been trained to prosecute themselves before anyone else gets the chance. The road back from this is not about being told your perceptions are valid, though that matters. It is not about someone else confirming your reality, though that helps in the early stages. The real work is in rebuilding the internal trust, in learning slowly and with tremendous patience to stay with your own perception long enough to examine it rather than immediately dismantling it, to feel something and let it exist for a moment before questioning whether you have the right to feel it, to remember something and hold it as yours, even when a voice, internal now, not external, tries to rewrite it. It is the work of rebuilding a self from the inside out, of learning to be a trustworthy witness to your own life again, because the truth was always there. The perceptions were always valid. The memories were always real. They were never the problem. They were just in the hands of someone who needed them to be. Most people think recovery is a straight line. You get hurt, you get help, you get better. You move through stages that build on each other in a clean, logical sequence, and eventually you arrive at a place called healed and you stay there. That model works reasonably well for some kinds of pain. It does not work for this one. Recovery from narcissistic abuse does not move in a straight line. It moves in circles, in spirals, in unexpected reversals that can make a person feel on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months into their healing that they have made absolutely no progress at all. And that feeling is not a sign that something is wrong with their recovery. It is a sign that they are in it. Because healing from narcissistic abuse is not primarily about recovering from what was done to you. It is about recovering who you were before it was done. And those are two completely different processes. One is about processing events. The other is about reconstructing a self. And reconstructing a self that was methodically dismantled over months or years is not something that happens in a linear sequence. It happens in layers. It happens unevenly. It happens in the middle of ordinary moments when you least expect it and often cannot explain it to anyone around you. This is what makes a recovery from narcissistic abuse unlike recovery from almost any other relational wound. When a healthy relationship ends, there is grief, real, significant grief. But the person who walks away from that grief still knows who they are. They still have access to their own values, their preferences, their instincts, their sense of humor, their way of moving through the world. They are sad, they are not lost. The relationship ended, but the self remained intact. In narcissistic abuse, the self does not remain intact. That is precisely the nature of the damage. The abuse did not happen alongside the person's identity. It happened to the person's identity. It targeted the very things that make a person recognizably themselves. Their confidence in their own perceptions, their right to have needs, their belief that their feelings are valid, their voice, their values, which were mocked or reframed, which a person began to see them as flaws, their sense of what they deserve, which was recalibrated downward, so gradually they never noticed it happening. So when the relationship finally ends, the survivor does not simply grieve and move forward. They grieve and then look around for the self they are supposed to move forward with, and find that it is partially missing, fragmented, buried under years of accommodation and self-erasure and the daily labor of surviving someone who required them to be less so that person could feel like more. And rebuilding that self is not a therapeutic exercise. It is not a checklist. It is not something that happens because you read the right book or understood the right concept or cried the right amount in the right therapist's office. It is a lived process. It is slow and it is uncomfortable, and it requires something that narcissistic abuse specifically destroys: the willingness to trust yourself. Think about what that means in practice. Reclaiming your identity means making choices based on what you actually want, rather than what will manage someone else's reaction. But narcissistic abuse trained you to make every choice through the filter of someone else's reaction. So now, standing in the freedom of a life where that person is no longer controlling you, the simple act of making a preference-based decision can feel strangely terrifying. What do I want for dinner? What do I want to do this weekend? What do I actually believe about this? These questions, which are trivially easy for someone who has never had their autonomy systematically removed, can land with unexpected weight on a survivor, because they require trusting the inner voice. And the inner voice was the first casualty. Reclaiming your identity also means allowing yourself to have needs again. Real needs. Not just the stripped down, minimized, apologized for version of needs that survive the relationship. Actual human needs for respect, for consistency, for reciprocity, for space, for honesty. Naming those needs out loud to yourself first and then eventually to others can feel almost physically dangerous for someone who was punished for having needs, whose needs were regularly described as demands, as manipulation, as proof of how difficult they were to love. Learning to say "I need this" without immediately softening it, explaining it, apologizing for it, or withdrawing it the moment someone's face shifts slightly, that is not a small thing. That is, for many survivors, one of the most radical acts of the entire recovery process. And then there is the identity itself, the specific texture of who this person was before the abuse shaped them. Because narcissistic relationships do not just remove things from a person, they add things that do not belong. They install beliefs. I am too much, I am not enough, I am fundamentally difficult to love, I need to earn my place in every room I enter. They install reflexes: shrink, accommodate, monitor, apologize. They install a relationship to the self that is fundamentally adversarial, where the person's learned to see their own needs, emotions, and perceptions as problems to be managed rather than signals to be trusted. Part of recovery is identifying what belongs to you and what was installed by the abuse. And this is harder than it sounds. Because those installed beliefs have been living inside the person long enough to feel like original furniture. They feel native. They feel like personality traits rather than wounds. A person may spend months in therapy before they realize that the relentless self-criticism they assumed was just part of who they are actually began as the narcissist's voice and was gradually internalized until it became indistinguishable from their own. The moment a survivor recognizes that for the first time that the harshest voice in their head is not theirs is one of the most significant turning points in the entire recovery. Because you cannot reclaim territory you do not know was taken. Recovery also requires something that the culture around healing does not talk about enough. It requires grief for the self that was lost, not just grief for the relationship, grief for the years spent making yourself smaller, grief for the version of you that existed before the abuse and may never be fully recovered, grief for the experiences you missed, the opportunities you did not take, the other relationships you may have damaged or avoided because your nervous system was occupied with surviving someone who was quietly consuming you from the inside. That grief is real and it deserves space, not as a place to stay permanently, but as a necessary part of the process. Because you cannot fully inhabit the self you are rebuilding if you have not properly mourned the self that was taken. And through all of this, the non-linear progress, the unexpected setbacks, the slow excavation of who you actually are beneath who you were shaped to be, there is one thing that matters more than any technique, any framework, any piece of advice. It is the accumulation of small daily experiences in which you choose yourself, in which you listen to your instinct instead of silencing it, in which you feel a need and name it instead of burying it, in which you disagree with someone and do not immediately collapse into apology, in which you sit with discomfort without immediately managing it away. These moments do not feel dramatic. They do not feel like healing milestones. They feel like ordinary decisions on ordinary days. But they are the actual material of recovery. They are the repetitions through which a new nervous system learns what the old one forgot, that you are allowed to exist fully, that your presence does not require justification, that you do not have to earn the right to take up space. Healing from narcissistic abuse is not the story of getting back to who you were. It is the story of becoming, for the first time, who you were always supposed to be before someone decided that person was too much of a threat to their control. And that person, the one emerging slowly, imperfectly, courageously on the other side of all of this, was worth fighting for all along.